Okay, theory. A plane blade can be considered as, the cutting edge can be considered as the intersection of two planes. This is kind of like high school geometry here a little bit. The intersection of two planes is a straight line, and our job in sharpening is to make that line as perfect as possible. One plane here is, of course, the bevel, and the other is the back. And to make that line perfect, we have to flatten this side, which is the bevel, and we have to flatten this side, which is the back. So both planes need to be perfectly flat to achieve a perfect line at the intersection. That, in a nutshell, is the entire theory of sharpening a plane blade. So what does that mean? Well, that means that, like it or not, you're going to have to sharpen the back of your plane blade. Today we're going to do this sort of typical Stanley 2-inch blade. It would the kind of blade that would be found in a Stanley number 4 or a Stanley number 5. This was a spare blade that I had around, which I never got around to sharpening. So that's going to be our demonstration project for today. So the first thing you have to do is flatten the back. Now, when it comes to flattening the back, there are two possibilities. One is you can be lucky. And if you're lucky, some previous owner of this plane blade has already flattened the back. Generally, if you've had someone who knew what they were doing and they've already flattened the back, then this job is not going to be too terribly difficult. On the other hand, you might be unlucky and no one's ever touched the back of the plane blade, and possibly even worse, it's corroded to some extent and has pitting. If that's the case, you've got a tough road ahead of you. So the good news is this plane blade shows some distinct evidence of having been flattened in the past. Frankly, it could have been me, and I don't remember one way or the other, but it's, somewhat shiny. There's some scratch marks here. Clearly it's already had some work on this. So in that case, I'm going to guess that I can start out with the water stones to flatten the back. Now, if you're in the unlucky category, you're probably going to have to back up to coarser grits like with sandpaper. A water stone, if you've got a back that's not flattened and you try to start out with an 800 grit water stone, it could take hours. And don't ask me how I know this, as they say. So, so basically, like I've got this piece of sandpaper affixed to the glass plate. I would probably put some grit of sandpaper there and try to flatten the back first before moving to water stones. But as I said, I think I'm probably going to be able to flatten this back starting with the water stone. So I'm going to get my newly flattened 800 grit water stone, and what we're basically just going to do is as simple as it sounds. We're going to rub the back across the stone until we can see shininess go all the way out to the edge. And actually, it's already looking good. It must have been me that did this, because that's looking pretty good already. All right, so a couple of tips. One thing that's handy to have with water stones is a spray bottle of water. That way you can occasionally spritz your stone and keep going. Another thing that's a handy little tip is it can be very difficult to hold on to these blades, especially if there's a lot of friction. Oftentimes I use a magnet and do this, and that gives me a handle to help when flattening the blade. Now, one thing to be careful here is the magnet needs to be smooth, because if there's imperfections in the magnet, generally the weight or the magnetism will be enough to distort the plane blade, and you know, once you take the magnet away, then it was flat when it was being held by the magnet, but it's not flat once you remove the magnet. So you have to have a smooth magnet to work with. All right, just a little tip. That I use that a lot. I'm going to just do hand work here because I think that's going to be sufficient. I try to keep fingers on the edge of the blade, close to the edge, and I wash it off occasionally and see how I'm doing. You can sort of see shininess down here. That's looking good. You know, once you flatten one of those planes, even though we haven't touched this plane yet, you can already feel sharpness beginning to develop there. So indeed, all these are good signs showing that we're on track, and it's looking promising. So I think at this point we're going to try moving on. Oh, another thing I should say is you're not trying to sharpen the entire back of the blade. In fact, that would probably be impossible because the blade probably isn't even it is probably bent. You can see this one is got a little curvature right here. So sharpening the entire back of the plane blade is an impossibility. You actually only, technically speaking, you only need to sharpen a few millimeters close to the edge, really. But of course, then you have trouble registering of flat surfaces against a stone. So if you have a blade that has planarity problems, you really only need to sharpen the end of it like this, if that's what, if you need to. That will help. The less metal that you have to remove and still get a good job, the better off you are. Okay, we're going to move on because that's feeling pretty good. Now, another question here is, how do we know the back is flat enough? Other than the things I've just talked about, another thing to look for is when you do get to the end of the sharpening process and you're sharpening the primary bevel, as we're sharpening this bevel, you're going to get a burr that you can feel on the back side of the plane blade. If you are doing the primary bevel and you don't feel this burr back here, that probably means that you didn't get the back sufficiently flattened. Okay, we're going to, like I say, we flatten frequently, so we're going to flatten this thing before we put it back in the tub. Going to get the 1200 grit out here. Now, as I said, it takes a lot of work to do this, but it should only be a one-time thing. Once you get the back flat, you're going to be working the primary bevel on successive sharpenings, but the back doesn't really change in the sharpening of the primary bevel. So once you get the back flat, that's probably the only time you should have to do it. So yes, it's a lot of work, but it should only be a one-time thing, and so it pays to do a good job, get it done, and never have to do it again. Now another thing you can look for, I'm not usually that, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You can see if you are getting rid of the sharp scratch pattern left by the previous grit. You can do this, you can do sideways. Again, notice my fingers are mainly exerting pressure on the end of the plane blade. You can do sideways. Take a look. Yeah, probably we'll work on this for a little while. So what I'm going to do here, because watching somebody flatten the back of a plane blade is like watching paint dry. I'm going to go off camera and finish this, and then we'll move on to the next grit. Okay, got done with the 1200 grit. Now we're going to go to the 6000 grit. Now the 6000 grit does not get soaked in water. You just spritz it until it gets pretty wet. And more of the same. Just now, a couple of comments here. At this point, with the 6000 grit, you ought to start seeing real shininess on the back of your blade. That's one. And then the second thing is, on this 6000 grit stone, you tend to get buildup here that you have to just, that will just basically, make the plane blade ride up off the surface of the stone, so you have to occasionally wipe it away so that you're getting real waterstone surface to work with. Okay, so we're going to work on this for a while. Again, like I say, there's not real reason to have this on camera, so I'll let you know when it's done. One last thing to note is I don't do the backs of my blade with the 15,000 grit stone. There's just no reason to do that. So be back in a minute once I'm done with this stone. Okay, I think we're done with the 6000 grit stone. So what you should look at here, you can see that it's a mirror-like finish on the back of this plane blade. Try to get it in the right focus point. Basically a mirror finish all the way out to the edge, across most, if not all, of the edge. I'm probably missing a little bit on each corner, but I'm not worried about that because I tend to camber on my blades anyway, and so those are not going to do not going to do very much of the cutting action on making a shaving. So I'm going to let those corners go. But I got a good solid 90% of it shiny all the way across. Now, one thing I should say, because I'm sure people will want to ask, is what about the ruler trick? Well, the ruler trick, I'm not going to go into it. I'll post a reference to a video by David Charlesworth that describes the ruler trick. The ruler trick, though, in short, is you put the plane on a stone, you just raise up the back end of the blade a tiny bit, and then grind the end of the blade so that you end up getting a very shallow bevel right here on the back. Typically the people say it's like 1 or 1.5 degrees worth of angle, and if you've had trouble flattening, I never use the ruler trick if I can get to this stage in flattening the back of a plane. I do use the ruler trick, but I use it by exception. So there are going to be plane blades that you encounter that, sad to say, will be nearly impossible to get to this level of flatness on the back. And in those cases, that's where the ruler trick comes in handy. So either if the back is grossly unflat, or in some cases there'll be some pitting on the back that will prevent getting a good flat next to the edge. And in those cases, by all means, go ahead and use the ruler trick, because you're probably never going to get to a good sharp edge any other way. Okay, enough said about the ruler trick. All right, so that concludes the portion on flattening the back of the plane blade. Now we're going to move to flattening the other plane that we talked about, which is the bevel. So stay tuned, we'll be back in just a minute.